Good morning.
Good morning, Glenn. How are you?
Good. How's everyone?
Okay, it's a lovely morning here in Los Angeles.
Sunny California. Very good.
Yeah, it rained last week, which is badly needed, and so it's a little good, but we have still shortage of water.
Yeah.
Always. How's the weather there? New Zealand?
Cooling down, but still beautiful.
Still beautiful?
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Mm.
You're coming to LA anytime?
Oh, I'd love to.
Yeah.
Yeah, but there's no plans for it right at the moment, no.
Yeah, okay, whenever it happens, yeah.
Yeah. Any plans to come to New Zealand?
No, my sister is asking me to go to Australia, but
nice.
I have all this bigger family in India, so
yeah, of course.
All the time off goes to going to India.
Yeah, I've also been thinking about heading to India.
When year end, maybe.
Oh, yep.
Yeah.
Good. Right. Well, we have gone the half hour, so let's begin. Om Sahana Vavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Sahaviryankarvavahe Tejasvinavadi Dhamastu Mavid Vishavahe. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Okay, so we are continuing with the chapter 21. Let's go back to the beginning and have a quick recap of what we've covered. Chapter 21 is entitled That Thou Art. In fact, before we go to that, are there any questions on anything before we get into the text? Okay, as always, chat box is there, so is the microphone, so feel free to jump on. So we started this chapter by going through the 4 aphorisms, which are 4 of the statements made in different Upanishads, and they basically cover the entire philosophy of Vedanta, or at least its main theme. Brahman is consciousness. The reality is consciousness. This is the first statement. It's a declaration. That thou art. That was the second statement. It's saying that, you can think of it as a response to the question, what is that reality? Or even who am I? That thou art. You are that reality. The second statement is a statement of advice. It's advice given. The third statement is a statement of practice. This self is Brahman. So this is the method to realize the truth, which is to have constant remembrance of this declaration of this truth about who and what we are. We're not this limited body, mind, intellect. We are the reality. So a constant reminder, this self is Brahman, is consciousness. And the final statement is a statement of experience. I am Brahman. So that indicates the state of self-realization. So he says that was the key there. Remember this truth at all times. That's the third aphorism, is the statement of practice. So the section that we finished with last time was talking about our original being, the waker, dreamer, deep sleeper, and you, and then I am God. All right. So we touched again on this idea of waker, dreamer, and deep sleeper. We go through these 3 different personalities, through these 3 different states. When you analyze the 3 states, the question naturally arises as to who is going through them. Because we say at one time I'm a waker, and another time I'm a dreamer, at another time I'm a deep sleeper. There's 4 entities in that analysis. There's the waker, the dreamer, the deep sleeper, and there's the I who goes through them. We say, I have become the waker or the dreamer or the deep sleeper. So there's the waker, the dreamer, the deep sleeper, and you. So the question is, well, what is that you? Who is that you? And that's answered with this idea of I am God. So the word God here doesn't refer to a sort of a creator being, an entity who sort of sits up in the clouds and so forth. God here refers to that Brahman. It refers to consciousness. So who is going through the three states of consciousness? Well, it's an unconditioned consciousness. And so this is what we finished off last time, and where he says the affirmation I am God is not the same as affirming I am Indian, I am bachelor, I am tall, etc. So the analogy that we used to understand that was the rope and the snake. If there is a rope lying in the garden and it's low light, a young boy walks past it and doesn't see the rope, he sees a snake. There's an illusory snake there. Now, there's a statement such as the snake is green, the snake is coiled, the snake is 4 inches thick, etc. These are all statements that talk about the qualities or attributes of the snake. But when the Father says the snake is rope, it's a completely different kind of statement. It's not the same sort of statement as the snake is green. In the same way, I can say I am tall, I am short, Indian, American, I am a bachelor, I'm single, I am good, bad, smart, etc. All these different things we can say about ourselves. That's talking about the personality covering, the snake. To say I am God is something fundamentally different. It's not talking about the quality or the properties of the matter components. It's talking about the underlying truth. But in order to accept that truth, what we have to do is drop our individuality. Currently, the belief is I am this body, mind, and intellect. That is the individuality, the belief that I am this BMI. You can't hold the truth or the insight, I am God, and the truth, the insight, I am an individual. They're incompatible. And so this is one of the difficulties of any kind of change, is that we have to give up what is familiar to us, give up the known. And he says, the people of the world are timid, hesitant to admit the truth. They dread the thought of losing their individuality. So that's the problem, is that we are attached to our individuality. And as a consequence, it's difficult for us to give that up. Okay, any questions before we get into where we left off? In the Old Testament, Moses is said to have fallen into this state of slavery. Walking on Mount Sinai, he encountered a serpent and trembled at the sight of it. Just then he heard a voice say, "Hold the serpent." It was said to be the voice of God. Moses hesitated. The voice insisted he get hold of it. He plunged and held the serpent. Instantly, the serpent turned into a staff, and the staff worked miracles. Moses touched the rock with the staff, and fresh water gushed forth from it. When the Israelites were fleeing for safety, the Red Sea stood in their way. He again used the staff. No sooner his staff touched the sea than the waters parted and dry land appeared before them. The Israelites passed into safety. Similarly, the inner voice bids you drop your ego and regain your supreme self. But you are terrified at the thought of discarding your individuality, your personal identity, mortified to leave the comforts of the known and plunge into the unknown. You would rather indulge in the pleasure of your senses than trade on the treasure of the self. Your inherent ignorance is the cause of your trepidation. You must get over this ignorance and gain the knowledge of self. Embolden yourself to overcome the ego, Plunge into the self fearlessly, smother your selfishness, assert your divinity. Your supreme self unfolds itself. You become the Supreme Lord. So a very simple narrative there. You got Moses, who is commanded to pick up the snake, pick up the serpent. He hesitates. So that's the hesitation that we feel to drop the ego, to pick up, as he says, divinity. The hesitation is that, you might get bitten by the snake. There's something painful about it. In the same way, there's something painful about dropping your individuality. And this happens in all walks, at all levels of life. We're not just talking here spirituality. Going from one job to another, going from one school to another, if you're a child, moving house, moving cities, there's always trepidation with change. We don't know what's coming. We'd rather hold on to a bad relationship than get out of it, because at least it's known to us. So he says, the inner voice bids drop your ego. That's the voice of the conscience. So I've used this idea before, that the conscience is the voice of the subtle intellect. The subtle intellect is that which posits your true nature, yourself. It makes that distinction between ego and self, capital S. That subtle intellect always points towards your true self. So that conscience is the voice of the subtle intellect. It knows when we are doing something that does not align to our true self, or rather, to put it another way, when it's coming from ego and satisfying the ego. The conscience is always calling for us to get back to the self. Yeah.
Question. So, Glenn, are that passage is comparing snake to the ego?
No, not directly, because you don't grab the ego.
No, not directly, but the thought is how frightful to pick up the snake is. So similarly, it's kind of hard to give up the ego, is the point, is it?
Yeah, you can. That's the point, is that it's as hard to give up the ego as it would be to grab a snake. It's actually more difficult, but that's the point, is that there's that sense of hesitancy or trepidation or fear associated with dropping the ego, or to put it another way, picking up divinity. To pick up.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
I think. The thing is, it's very. I don't know. I just feel it. It's not a good example in the sense we mortals, obviously the snake is. I wish. I mean, it's so hard even to think of snake, even going near it. So that seems like a Herculean task to pick up a task. So it makes it look like it would be so hard to give up the ego,
And it is very difficult to give up the ego.
Yeah.
It's. I mean, Eve, try it.
Yeah.
It's not that I can, I just don't want to. It is a Herculean task to drop the ego, or to pick up or assert divinity.
Yeah.
Because it seems, and he talks about this in the book The Fall of the Human Intellect, when he's talking about just our standard sort of belief patterns and likes and dislikes. Unless you're working hard, you're lazy. Unless you're really working yourself to burn out, you're lazy. This is just maybe a thought pattern you pick up in childhood.
Mm-hmm.
Even something like that is very difficult to drop as an adult, even though I know that it's not true, that I don't have to be working 24/7 in order to be considered not lazy. Even though I know it intellectually, I still find that I overwork myself.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Because I haven't dropped that thought. And that's just one thought. The idea of dropping the ego is, it's really a Herculean task. And it's the difficulties associated with, first of all, not knowing, as he says, the cause of this is the ignorance. Now, partly there's ignorance here that we just don't know the distinction between ego and true self, so there's nothing to reach for. But even when we do know that distinction between ego and higher self, even then it's very hard to give up the ego because we don't know what we're going into. The comfort of the known keeps us where we are.
So we're not even aware that when we go about that, it's the ego which is making us say things, do things.
Yeah, what's making you say and do things is is the mind and intellect.
Right.
These are the impulses or the causes of our actions. We're familiar with that receipt, reaction, response mechanism. We receive stimuli from the external environment.
Right.
They react with the mind and intellect, and then we respond back into the world. So it's the mind and intellect that make us make choices, that make us do things. The ego is the belief that I am my thoughts, I am my impulses, I am my urges, I am my desires, I am my body, I am my actions. It's the belief that that's who I am. So the distinction we make is, or the example is the distinction between the waker and the dreamer. When you're in the dream, you believe I am this body. Okay, it's one that has a leg missing, which is much older. You believe you are that body. You wake up, oh, I'm not that old amputee. I'm me. I believe I'm this body. So the ego is not what makes us do things as such. It's the mind and intellect that make us do things. But the ego has a role in that the more we have a belief that I am, for example, my thoughts, then the less freedom I have to choose apart from them. But if I have thoughts, let's go back to an earlier example. Let's say I have thoughts, you should be working, you should be working. If I have less ego, I can say, there's that thought pattern arising in my mind again. If I'm more detached, objective to it, if I'm able to look at it rather than looking through it, then I'm free from it. Even though the urge is telling me, it's Sunday morning and you should be working. Even though that urge is there, I can be free from it. I can choose to or not go with it. And that's that again is the part of the spiritual growth, is our ability to stand apart from what the mind and intellect are doing.
So it's more the ignorance than, like when you say we do things and think some things, do some things, is because of ignorance of higher consciousness.
Yeah, and that's why he says, get hold of the knowledge of self. That's the real antidote to it all, is to gain self-knowledge. The moment you see something, you then act from that basis. When you are eating a certain food, a certain favorite food that you have, it may be unhealthy for you. And, you've got absolutely no idea. And then you read in an online forum that this particular food is unhealthy in this way. Now you know it, but you're still eating it.
Yes. And
then you get to a point where you say, it's really true, actually. This does have these negative consequences. I'm going to stop eating it. Then you know it. So in the first stage, complete blackout, just ignorance of the facts. You don't have the material knowledge available to you. In the second phase, you have the material knowledge available to you, but it hasn't yet modified your behavior. It hasn't modified your choices. You haven't really seen it. And then when you see that aha moment, a friend of yours catches a terminal illness, and someone puts it down to the food, then it becomes real for you. It hits home. Then you have it as insight. And so that's the idea of gaining knowledge of self. The moment you begin to see, maybe I'm not my thoughts, then you can separate yourself from them. So it says, smother your selfishness, assert your divinity. So that's that process of negation and assertion that we touched on earlier. So he gives now an analogy to describe the relationship between the self, capital S, and the individuality, or a human being. So what he's talking about just before that is this idea of dropping the individuality, asserting the divinity. So in order to do that, you have to be able to distinguish between individuality and self. We have to hold the two thoughts and separate them. Mm-hmm. So in order to do that, we have a way of visualizing the relationship between the self and the individual. And so this is what he brings in next, this petrol example. He says, you gain some idea of what you really are, how God operates, by studying an amazing similarity between God and petrol. God, the Supreme Self, functions in beings in the same way as petrol and motor vehicles. There are 3 points of comparison which bring them remarkably close. 1. Petrol is the prime mover in all cars, but petrol does not move. It does not have a desire to go anywhere, nor a desire to avoid going. Yet no car moves without petrol. Similarly, the self, Atman, is the activating principle in all beings, but the self does not act. It has no desire to act, nor a desire to avoid action. Yet no action is possible without the self. Okay, first analogy. It's also the first part of the analogy. You can't move your car without petrol. It doesn't have any vitalizing fuel. It sits idle, unmoving. But despite the fact that you can't move without petrol, the petrol itself doesn't have movement, and it doesn't have a desire to move, obviously. How does that track? The personality is always moving, if you like. It's going in one direction, as you said. We are doing things. We're going from one place to another physically. We are moving in our minds, different moods, desires, different thoughts, belief patterns. We're becoming a new person as we grow and evolve through life. We're going places. The individuality goes places. We have a desire for growth, we go to growth. We have a desire for, anything, we go there. But there is a dimension of the personality that has no desire, that is always at rest. Those aspects of the personality that are, if you like, confused with desire, there's a sense of disparity. There's a driving force. Something is not quite right. So there's not a sense of being at rest. There's a tension. If I can only have enough money to be satisfied, that'll be great. Then I feel settled in life. If I have a partner, if we have kids, or if I just had a higher status position in the company, there's things that we want. We feel a gap between where we are and where we should be, and so we move. There's a dimension of the personality that never feels this incompleteness. It is always at rest and ever perfectly satisfied. It's the part of the personality that allows us to experience, that allows us to act. It's the enlivening principle. It's consciousness. You can't be conscious of anything without consciousness. So that's the first comparison. You can't go anywhere without petrol. but petrol has no desire to go anywhere. Similarly, you can't do anything without the consciousness, but consciousness has no desire to do or to be anything. So that can become a self-reflection. Posit that and search for it. Okay, what do I want? Name something that you want in life. Okay, I want spiritual growth. I want company, whatever. Look for that part of the personality that has no desire for these things, that is present, allowing you to experience, but is free from desire. Okay, any questions on that first aspect? Second, the performance level of a small car is poor, and a medium car is mediocre, and a big car powerful. The performances of the three types are distinct, wide apart, yet the petrol used in them is the same. So it is with the different personalities. The self, Atman, in an illiterate, uncivilized person is the same that is in an intelligent, civilized person, and that in an exceptional, enlightened sage. Their caliber and conduct are distinctly different, yet one Atman pervades through them all. Okay, another simple aspect here. 3 different cars, different engine types, different configurations, different performances. Low, medium, and high performance vehicles. The petrol that goes into them is the same. Okay, in a similar way, human beings have a huge range of levels of performance in terms of intelligence, emotional intelligence, the different proclivities, how well we do things. You can categorize human beings along a spectrum of different qualities and properties. What causes them to function is the same. So you have a vicious, ego-ridden individual causing havoc for the community. You have an evolved, altruistic person healing the community. They have diametrically opposed functions in the community, if you want to use that word. What activates them to function is the same. So irrespective of how the individual functions, that enlivening source is the same in all. Number 3, a car goes off an embankment and crashes. The inmates of the car are hospitalized while another car takes its passengers home safely. But the petrol in both cars is the same. The petrol cannot be labeled as safe or unsafe. Yet, if the first car had run out of petrol a few meters away, it would not have met with the accident. Nevertheless, petrol cannot be held responsible for the accident, nor take credit for the safe arrival of the other car. So it is with the Atman. In a terrorist, it manifests as atrocious acts of destruction, while in a sage, it manifests as divine deeds of benevolence. The Atman remains neutral, responsible neither for vice nor virtue that emanates from it. So this third aspect, he says here, you can perform an action that is vicious, you can perform an action that is virtuous. Now, they are opposite. But they both spring from the same forth. They both spring from the same source. The dimension of the personality that is not good or bad, is not vicious or virtuous. That is the analogy he's drawing here. So in the aspect of the car, it's the outcome. This is what he's looking at. One crashes, one arrives home safely. Atman is neutral. The petrol is neutral with regards to safety or accident. You don't blame the petrol and say, well, that must have been dangerous petrol. In the same way, you find a person who's vicious, and you might say at his core, that guy is absolutely vicious. Not true. At his core, he's neutral. You find someone else who's highly virtuous, and you say at his core, that guy is just perfect virtue. No, nor is he virtuous at his core. At his core, he is consciousness, which is neither vicious nor virtuous. So it's a question that has come up a number of times before. If human beings are inherently good, then why do we perform bad actions? Well, the answer to the question is that human beings are not inherently good. We are inherently consciousness. We are inherently neutral. And that neutrality provides us the space to choose virtue or vice. The self is the stage on which virtue and vice get to play. You can't blame the stage. You can't say the stage is vicious when it's a scene of murder. You can't say the stage is virtuous when it's a scene of help. So again, there's a dimension of the personality liberated from the constraints of vice and virtue, which defies these categories. As you start to identify this, identify with it, then we cease to define ourselves in these terms of virtue and vice. We rise above those categories. There's a total self-acceptance that begins to come from that. In order to accept what is, again, let's limit the discussion here to our personality. In order to accept the nature of this particular being, we have to look at it from outside it, rather than looking through the personality. Self-acceptance means recognizing the virtue and the vice and being able to sit with them in a way where you don't feel reactive. You see your virtue and get a little ego kick. You see your vice and feel a little bit of shame. You become affected by viewing your own personality. Acceptance means stepping back into a dimension in which virtue and vice don't apply, and from there viewing the personality as, oh yeah, here's some virtue, here's some vice. It's seeing things in totality. Otherwise, we tend to put these blinkered glasses on and we see ourselves and say, oh, I'm a terrible person. Everywhere I go, I spread disharmony, or everywhere I go, I do this bad thing. Or the opposite, we get a sort of inflated sense of our own self-worth because we don't have enough of an appreciation for our vices, if you want to put it that way. This third element, or this third aspect of the analogy, helps to bring this awareness in. You're neither virtuous nor vicious. You're a mixture of your mind and intellect. Your personality is a mixture of virtue and vice. You are neither of these. You're not responsible for virtue and vice. Not realizing these truths of life, diverse activities are attributed to the self, to Atman, to God. You hold God responsible for everything that happens in the world. You blame God when something goes wrong and praise God when all goes well. You must reflect carefully over this equation between God and petrol. Get out of this colossal misconception. Understand God as merely the substratum of all activities and not hold God responsible for the variety of activities in the world. So this idea you can think of as obviously something that a religious person may be faced with. If a person has a belief in God, that if something good has happened, I have been blessed. If something bad has happened, I've been cursed. there's even a perspective of this that you could bring in for someone who doesn't have a belief in God. When something goes wrong, why me? Why has this happened to me? Says the atheist. Who's he talking to when he says that? Some terrible catastrophe has befallen him. Why me? To whom is he speaking? Well, okay, to himself, all right? Or, to the room, or to life, or to the environment, or to nature, whatever. You can think of that as that tendency to put the cause of good and bad elsewhere. There is no motivation for good or bad things to happen in the self. The choices that are made are not made influenced by the self. Again, you go back to that idea that that guy is inherently good. He makes good choices. Okay, he's not inherently good. The good choices that he makes are not being influenced by his true self. That's just the space that allows the personality to act. As you start to practice this idea, you begin to see in others an underlying self that is not defined by the motivations, urges, and desires that they have. It's not defined by the actions that they perform, and it's not defined by their intentions behind those actions. When that happens, you relate more to that dimension of who and what they are. As a consequence, the things that they do and say, of course, you're aware of them, but they land on you without affecting you. Someone says something that is vicious. It could be about you or your family or something you hold dear. As you begin to develop a little bit of this insight, what that person says, it lands on you in the same way that perceptions land on your eyes. You see a landscape, that landscape sits on your eyes without any burden whatsoever. It doesn't become heavy the longer you look at something. In a similar way, as you start to relate to this different aspect of life, things happen, they land on you, but without burden. It again comes back to this idea of acceptance. A vicious person is in front of you. You are able to accept the perceptions, emotions, and thoughts emanating from them because you're relating to a spiritual self, not an ego self. So the notion of acceptance doesn't mean enabling or permitting. Okay, if someone is being vicious in your environment, acceptance can include calling them on what they're doing, stepping in, intervening to stop it. If it's bad enough, of course, off they go to the magistrate and then to prison. Acceptance does not preclude any of these actions. It doesn't mean that we don't feel certain emotions. Okay, a vicious person acts in a particular way. We may feel heartbreak. We may feel sadness. That's not outside the idea of acceptance of things. Acceptance means that you're viewing what's going on from this higher platform. So he says, reflect over this equation between God and petrol. So you reflect it in two ways. One is just to understand it. So you'd be able to explain the comparisons to somebody else. But the second is to try and see the underlying truth, because this is an analogy, remember. What's the analogy pointing at? So these three aspects are pointers. They are ways of managing our attention to identify with something else. So once you've understood them, you can try to practice them in life. Any clarifications before we move on?
Again, many of the, at least this is a comment from me, philosophies of Vedanta is for understanding. But if I were to ask you that, just now you gave the example, if somebody says bad things about you or the family, it just, it should land on you and you just accept it, right? Does that also help, again, dealing with the practical, dealing with the emotions? You feel bad, you feel like fighting back, you feel like giving explanation. What is the thing to do? Just accept it and be aware.
So when we talk about acceptance, it's acceptance of the whole process of receipt, reaction, response, and everything that goes with it. Yeah. So someone says something to you,
yes,
you might feel sad.
Right.
You accept that. You accept that and you can see what the person is doing. They're deliberately trying to make you feel bad. Right. You see that and you accept it. Mm-hmm. You feel bad, you accept that. You recognize that this person needs to be called out. You feel frustration, you accept that. You recognize the person needs to be called out on what they're doing. So you do that. And you get into, a minor confrontation with them about it. You accept that.
Mm-hmm. But do you actually do it? You
do it. You're doing all of these things, yeah. The best example of this is Bhagavad Gita. Mm-hmm. Arjuna is faced with fighting a righteous war against his cousins. So in the initial stages of the text, he says, this is too much for me to handle, I can't do it. By the end of the text, he says, I'm going to get up and fight. So the ideal is that there's an acceptance. Yes, this is the way things are, and this is what I need to do. So he's going to go and fight and do all the things that a warrior does with the same emotions, and the same enthusiasm, and the same everything. Where this stance helps us is that we are objective to what's going on. And the moment we are objective, we have a dimension of freedom and control that is not present otherwise. Okay, so there's two ways to look at this. The first is that if we're involved in our reactions, then the next moment will take the direction of that particular emotion. Mm-hmm. If I'm angry and I'm caught up in my anger, then whatever I do next is dictated by the anger. Mm-hmm. If I'm objective to it, the anger arises, but I don't have to do what the anger says. Mm-hmm. I can now draw on it. There's an emotion which is in my personality. I can draw on that. So when I speak to the person, I speak in a particular way with a particular tone of voice, with particular body language, with a particular force. I use certain words. I'm drawing on that anger to, if you like, flavor what I'm going to do and what I'm going to say. But it's still a choice. There's still freedom. I'm objective to it. Mm. So that's one of the differences, is that when you're objective, like in this way, then you don't get taken along for the ride of what your emotions do. They're there. They're a part of you. It's that emotion is an aspect that resides within your larger self. It doesn't define you. And so it comes and it goes. Whereas when we're involved, something like anger will come and stay because we keep on re-inflicting that same thought pattern. So that's the first way to think about it, is that we're free from it in the sense that we have that scope of choice available to us now.
Mm-hmm.
The second is that we're not affected by it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's that idea of, when you see a landscape, you're not burdened by it. So you might feel, say, sadness, but you're not burdened by that sadness. You recognize that that's a natural part of the receipt, reaction, response mechanism in nature. Nature has all these things going on, and one of them is the sadness that has arisen in my personality to hear that person speak in that way or to watch them do that thing. We're not affected. So there's a big difference between feeling the emotions and being affected by them. And this is actually one of the key distinctions we need to make, because if we don't, then we can wrongly understand the principle of objectivity and falsely expect it to be the absence of certain types of emotions. As a spiritual person, I would never feel anger. As a spiritual person, I would never feel outrage or sadness. Well, as a spiritual person, you won't be affected by nature, but we shouldn't presume to know what nature is going to do next. Spiritual person goes through joy and sorrow. It's just that they're not affected by it. And if we try to force a limited understanding of objectivity or spirituality onto ourselves, then we end up suppressing nature. I'm feeling some resentment towards that person. But if I was spiritual, I wouldn't be feeling any resentment. So I'll use a gratitude practice and I'll stuff the resentment down. I'll push it to the side.
Mm-hmm. Or
I'll take this idea of rising above body, mind, and intellect and just nicely float above my resentment so I don't really have to deal with it or see it. Mm-hmm. Or I do a mindfulness practice and just observe it arising and stand apart from it. Okay, now there's nothing wrong with any of these practices, but if they're used to take us to a false understanding of what reality is, then we end up suppressing nature and we just get stuck in that loop. Objectivity is acceptance of what is. Good, the bad, the ugly, the indifferent, it's all part of the same phenomenon.
It's interesting because, at least talking personally, if someone says all this, somebody with whom you have no relationship, you're not a friend, says all these bad things. It has happened to me. So surprisingly, it doesn't affect you at all. You just say you let it go. Whereas if the same thing comes from your sister or your spouse or your good friend, it hurts you badly, and you kind of. So I guess that has to do with the lack of objectivity. In the other first case, it didn't bother at all because you had no relationship, you had no attachment. That explains it. So with the people we love, or if there is attachment.
That's the key. That's the difference, is that when we are attached to somebody, then they have the ability to affect us.
Okay.
Yeah. And the word attachment is used in very much the philosophical sense, because the word attachment has different meanings in other contexts. And in fact, psychology, for example, they talk about healthy attachment. Mm-hmm. So when we use the word attachment in philosophy, or Eastern philosophy, it refers to that unhealthy dependency. Mm-hmm. And so, as you say, there's an element of my relationship with, as you say, my sibling, which is beautiful and healthy. There's an exchange of, emotions and a feeling of support and kinship and so forth. But there's also an unhealthy part where if they do something, like you say, they say something, it can affect me now. I don't have the ability to protect myself from a certain type of experience because of my attachment. And that you're right, that's the difference. Yeah. And so, yeah, our objectivity is stronger or weaker in various parts of the world, or to various parts of the world, depending on our relationship with it. The more attached I am to it, the less my objectivity. So objectivity and detachment are synonyms. Yeah. Okay, so there's a couple of statements here in the chat box. As with the story of the snake and rope, are we seeing that supreme reality as being without speculation and thought? So in self, we are Brahman, with no intention, speculation, just objective to it, and therefore truly free, not impeded or defined by the outside. Yeah, so that's the idea. We are perfect. When a person is identifying with Brahman, someone who is self-realized, that person is entirely objective to nature. Everything that happens is happening out there in the realm of, the gunas out there in the realm of nature. There's a sense in which you are a witness to it. At the same time, remember, and this is what we were covering with the Ishavasya Upanishad, at the same time, you are the changing phenomena as well. So it's not a sense of complete disconnection. Like when you watch a tennis match, you're not either of the players. You've got nothing to do with the match at all. You're in the audience watching. So when a person resides in Brahman, there's a sense in which they are watching the phenomena of life play out. But we shouldn't take that to be that they are completely disconnected from it, like you're watching a tennis match. The one who resides in Brahman recognizes, I am outside all this, and I am inside all this. I am the changing phenomena as well. I am the environment. I am this receipt-reaction response mechanism. I am the body receiving the stimuli. I am the mind and intellect reacting with these emotions and these thoughts. I am the agent responding back. I am that. And I am also the unmanifest, the space in which it arises. And it's that complete picture, which is the objectivity. If we only take half of it and say, oh, I'm a detached witness, then we lose the other part, which is to say that I am also this. I am the body, mind, and intellect. And so again, that's where we can get into a sort of a suppression. I'm not my emotions. I don't just view them from a distance. I actually dissociate myself from them. So it's both. It's being in it and being outside it. People consider it sacrilegious to believe a human to be God and prefer to humble themselves to the status of bondage and limitation. They are lost in ignorance, remained blind to truth. It is false to believe yourself to be immortal, living a constricted, restricted life. You commit sin when you do not proclaim your immortal self, when you deny yourself as divinity. Therefore, gather up all your courage and conviction and face the stark reality. Renounce the false world. Pronounce your real self. Cry out to one and all, I am God, Aham Brahmasmi. So yeah, sacrilegious to accept that a human is God. And again, a human is not God as such. A human is the body, mind, intellect complex, but residing at the core of that being, the true essential aspect is capital S, self. So he says here, you commit sin when you do not proclaim your immortal self. So once again, there is that idea of the call of the conscience being towards the self. We touched on this. The inner voice bids you drop your ego and regain your supreme self. That's what the conscience is always calling for us to do. Return back to yourself. Return back to yourself. Anytime we do anything which asserts the idea, I am this body, this mind, this intellect, we are committing sin. So it puts everything in the realm of worldly activity potentially as sinful. What are you doing? I'm building this children's hospital. Sinful. What are you doing? I'm trying to grow as a human being. Sinful. Why? Because you're still proclaiming yourself to be this body, mind, intellect. And I am this body, mind, intellect. I just want to improve it. I am this body, mind, intellect, and I want to use it to build a children's hospital. Okay, now these are necessary steps on the path to realization, altruism and self-inquiry, self-knowledge. But to limit it to that, to not take the next step and try to realize your true self, he says that's going against what your conscience is calling for you to do. So moving in that direction, having that sense of self-inquiry. Who am I? He says, renounce the false world and pronounce your real self. So renouncing the false world, okay, so a bit of a broken record here today, saying the same thing. Renouncing it doesn't mean cutting it off unnecessarily or prematurely, is perhaps a better word. You know, elsewhere in the text, in chapter 13, he has this beautiful notion. He says, when the fruit ripens, the petals of the flower fall away. That's renunciation. I have a desire for such and such. As my maturity begins to ripen, that desire falls away naturally. You know, as a teenager, you have certain concerns, interests, things that are deeply important to you. They begin to fall away as you mature into an adult. You don't pull the petals off and hope to, that you grow. When you grow, they fall away. Desires leave you. Renounce the false world means the same thing. Put in the effort to see the truth, and then renunciation happens to you. How do you do that? Pronounce your real self. So we say no thank you to the things that we are able to say not necessary, not required. And we say yes to the higher direction. Ultimately, it's asserting that truth. I am God. Aham brahmasmi. Okay, let's just finish off this last section of this section. A man met with an accident. His new limousine was smashed. The same evening, he returned to his house and threw a party. His friends were reveling. No one knew the cause for his celebration. As the party was going on, a few were curious and inquired. The man told them what had happened. Perplexed at his reply, they asked, "Your new car is smashed and you are rejoicing?" He nodded. "You get me wrong. No doubt my car is destroyed, but I am saved. Only my vehicle is gone, but here am I, hale and healthy." Try to get the message from this simple narrative. Examine where people focus all their attention. Everyone is glued to one's body, mind, and intellect. None turns towards the self within. All you care for is your material equipments. You have no interest in the self. You save the vehicle at the cost of your person. This is preposterous. You lose your imperishable self and hang on to the perishable matter layers. What a blunder you commit in this choice, and yet you are blissfully unaware of it, much less concerned. It is a wonder that you have lost sight of your inherent divinity, forgotten your immortal self. It is a strange oblivion. Pull yourself out of this slumber. Awake, arise, assert your real self. Be yourself. You are God already. So yeah, the limousine gets smashed up, but I am safe. Rather than looking as though I have lost my limousine, you say I have retained myself, retained my life. It shows where the person's focus of attention is. On the important thing is my life, myself. Car comes and goes. Same thing. The important thing is not the vehicle of the body, mind, and intellect, but the self within it. And so as a practice, it's a matter of pulling yourself back into that reminder of who is the one in the vehicle, of the body, of the emotions, of the intellect, who's at the center of it. The body, mind, and intellect change, but that thought of oneself, one's true identity, he says that's the thing to hold on to. If you lose that, you lose everything. If the body, mind, and intellect change, but you retain that sense of who I am and what I am, you've gained everything. So that's the continuous practice. Awake, arise, assert your real self. Okay, any questions or queries?
Well, very helpful, lot to think about.
Yeah, as always, yeah.
It just has applications. You think Vedanta is all up there, but it's very practical applications too.
Yeah. If it's not practical, it's not really philosophy. It's just sort of intellectual entertainment. Yeah.
So it's in a way, knowledge and practice, I guess.
Yep, knowledge and practice.
It's not enough just to have the knowledge.
No, effort to practice as well, to integrate it.
Yeah. Thank you.
All right, thanks, folks. Back tomorrow at 6 p.m. Pacific time for Q&A. So feel free to send any questions through or join us and see what we're discussing. Until then, have a great day.
You too. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, folks.
So much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.